Well, joining me now is John O'Brien, former Detective Chief Superintendent and author of a book, The Great Deception, Dublin and Monaghan Car Bombings, 1974. Good morning, John, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Pat. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak with you and your listeners.
Now, this was a terrible tragedy. It was the day upon which most loss of life occurred in the entire period of the Troubles, and yet, for many people, it's been forgotten, not by the families, but by many young people who probably never knew it happened.
Yes, indeed, Pat, and indeed my thoughts today are with the families, and I met some of them indeed in recent times. They have had a very tough time. They have been ignored. They have been disregarded in the entire process. I have said that they should get a public apology, both from the British government and from the Irish government, because they really have had a raw deal in the entire process.
Now, what happened on the day, no warning bombs went off, 3 in Dublin and 1 in Monaghan. Can you talk us through the events of that day?
Yes, indeed, Pat. And the context, of course, is that in Northern Ireland, the first power-sharing executive was in place as well as of the Sunningdale Agreement. And for about 3 days, leading up to the 17th of May, the North was in lockdown. The Ulster Workers' Council strike, lioness on the street. Basically, the security forces unable to maintain order, power lockdown, and then also a really catastrophic situation economically and otherwise in the North. Now, the first inkling, and when I say the title of my book, The Great Deception, the first real deception was the fact that 3 car bombs, or 3 cars bearing bombs, came down to Dublin that afternoon, arriving into Dublin city centre sometime before 5:30. And the first of these synchronised car bombings, and it's very important to note that they were synchronised car bombings, something that didn't happen before or haven't happened since. At a few minutes approaching 5:30, the first car bomb exploded in Parnell Street, and 10 people were murdered there in Parnell Street, including the O'Brien family. One of the reasons I'm interested in this, and the human thing, was John O'Brien, Anna O'Brien, and their children, Anne-Marie and Jacqueline, were murdered there. Their name resonated with me from the start. That was followed very quickly by a car bomb in Talbot Street, where 15 people were killed. And then, very shortly after that, in South Leinster Street, where 2 people were killed. And then, subsequently, close to 7 o'clock that evening, another car bomb, technically a different type of car bomb, exploded in Monaghan. So that was the sequence. We had never seen anything on the scale before. We had one similar attack on the 1st of December 1972 when the Dáil was debating an extension to the Offences Against the State Act, and it looked very much like that the politicians were going to once more waver and not to introduce that legislation. 2 car bombs exploded in Dublin. Indeed, I was close to the one at Liberty Hall, and again in Sackville Place, where 2 busmen were murdered. And there was a political context to that. I think that's the point I'm making. Between both of those car bombs was a political context to it.
Now, in the case of these 3 bombs, which were claimed ultimately by the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, they had not shown that kind of technical expertise before.
That's correct. In my book, I think I listed 24 bombing attacks on the south by the UVF. And there is nothing in that sequence of horrendous events to indicate that level of expertise. As a matter of fact, the UVF were a series of bunglers, many own goals. Maybe the most tragic kind was the Miami Show Band in 1975, when they staged a mock checkpoint for the Miami Show Band, and in their attempt to implicate the show band in the conflict, they were trying to place a bomb into the van, the bus of the band, and that exploded prematurely. And the last one, Pat, which is very important and easy to forget, was 1994 at the Widow Scallon's pub in Dublin, where Sinn Féin were having a meeting, Sinn Féin IRA were having a meeting in the Widow Scallon's pub, and a UVF gang arrived with a satchel bomb. Now, this event was taking place on the first floor. They tried to make their way in. They were stopped by a doorman. They shot him. He was murdered. And they dropped the satchel. And a short time later, the detonator in that satchel ignited, but it didn't set off the explosion. Now, again, so important to remember these things. If that bomb had gone off, 200 or 300 people would have been killed. There would have been no peace process. But they were bunglers and killers. And of course, they didn't acknowledge their role, their so-called role in Dublin and Monaghan until 19 years later.
Now, the bombs in question were, I suppose to use the term, dirty bombs. They were packed with nails so they would damage and injure the people who didn't die most grievously. So there were many people who were maimed by those bombs when they went off. But what is extraordinary about all of this is how it went like clockwork for them. The cars were stolen, the cars were packed with explosives, the cars were driven to Dublin, parked in side streets effectively, and all went off within moments of each other. That sounds almost like military precision.
Well, there is no doubt, and I've researched this thing very carefully because, Pat, it's very easy to go to the conspiracy theory and so on. But the bottom line is the sophistication of the Dublin attacks, the 3 Dublin attacks, the synchronicity of those. There is no parallel in the terrorist playbook in Ireland where that was ever achieved. When I say achieved, I do that in inverted commas, either by the Provisional IRA, any other Republican group, or by the Loyalists. So most certainly the quality of the timers used were military, and the whole operation smacks of a military planned operation, because remember there was a bus strike in Dublin. The streets, it was 5:30 of a Friday evening, the streets were packed. Now you needed some logistical ability to be able to insert 3 car bombs into the city centre of Dublin, and then it be technically possible to explode them at the same time, because that was essentially what they did. Now, in my research, I found 2 British Army colonels who have cast an extremely interesting light on that. One was Lieutenant Colonel George Stiles, who was the British Army's explosive expert, ordnance expert in Belfast in the early 70s, and the other was a colleague of his, Lieutenant Colonel Nigel Wilde, who replaced him there. And they, together between them, they absolutely make the case for the unique technical aspect of the bombs, and they also make the case, maybe unwittingly, for the very high element of collusion that was involved in the bombing.
Now, you say that the victims and the surviving families deserve an apology, both from the British government and from the Irish government. What is the apology from the Irish government for? What exactly did it do or not do that left the families in a ridiculous position of knowing no one has been arrested, no real explanation has ever been given?
Yes, I mean, it wasn't until 2003 that we discovered that the Irish government, in the shape of Liam Cosgrave TD, had met with Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, on 2 occasions in 1974. 11th of September 1974 and the 21st of November 1974. And at that meeting, the British delegation told the Irish delegation, and this is well minuted, it was followed by Judge Barden, who was doing an inquiry on behalf of the Irish state, from 2000 to 2003. And it was a very simple, straightforward message delivered by the British. We have interned 25 people who were responsible for the Dublin and Monaghan bombing. We can't prosecute them in the courts, but we have interned them. Now, that was an extraordinary bit of information. But what is even more extraordinary is that information was not conveyed to the Minister for Justice, Patrick Cooney, who wasn't present at those meetings, or to the Garda Commissioner, or to any member of the Garda investigation team. And I am really disappointed that that particular salient fact has not been addressed by the politicians who have spoken so far on this topic, and I've looked elsewhere in terms of blame. But the bottom line is that's the first thing that the Dublin government failed to follow with that information, and they still haven't followed with that information and the significance of it. But conversely, Pat, and this is why I say the British should also apologise, they had found this information, they say, but they didn't follow up with it on their side. There is no reciprocal actions on their side, because if the information was correct, and it was, then they had mass killers in their own jurisdiction. And by the way, in 1974, the British government deproscribed the UVF. They were no longer a proscribed organisation. They were put back on the proscribed list, I think, in 1975.
Now, nobody has ever been brought to justice for this, and 50 years on, it's unlikely that anything will happen. But there are still some investigations.
Well, yes, and I guess if you're following the narrative, and I'm sure you are, you will have heard mention of Operation Denton.
Yeah.
As being the new saviour that's going to reveal all of the truth that will make it clear to the families and everybody who is responsible. Very important task to actually explain as easily as I can what Operation Denton actually is. And it's important to remember that it came about because a gentleman living in Northern Ireland took a judicial review which was heard in the Court of Appeal in Belfast, and that related to the failure of the PSNI to investigate historical activities of the Glenanne gang. This is the so-called loyalist gang around the farm in Glenanne, but also in Portadown and in Armagh. And they forced, the Court of Appeal then forced the British to instigate, and this is very, very important, to instigate a review. This is not a criminal investigation. That's the incredibly important part of it. And when the Chief Constable of the PSNI got that job to do, that direction from the Court of Appeal in the North, he was then handed that over to John Boucher, who at that stage was the head of Operation Canova. And in turn, that led to the renaming, and I hope this is not too complicated, of this new activity as Operation Denton. And that is what we are looking at here. But the effect of that is, and I am, as a former guard, as a former senior guard, I just cannot get my head around the idea that we have handed over the investigation or the elucidation around the Dublin and Monaghan bombings to another jurisdiction, and particularly a jurisdiction from which the bombings originated, where the killers were based, and where the security forces of the state have been accused of complicity with the people who actually drove the cars or brought them to Dublin and to Monaghan. This is an appalling vista. The Dublin government are still ignoring their responsibility, that it is their primary responsibility to initiate any inquiries in relation to the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, and to so direct the Garda Commissioner to do that. I do not buy the Operation Denton lie, no matter how many calming words we hear. And by the way, Pat, I could safely say from my research now, and I don't want to sound this too grandiose, we now have enough information to reach the balance of probability criteria for any inquiry that Dublin would order. And it really is the responsibility of Dublin. No country sublets the investigation of the single worst crime in the history of the country to another country, no matter how well disposed or otherwise that country is.
Well, your book is called The Great Deception, Dublin and Monaghan Car Bombings, 1974, and today is that 50th anniversary, and it's available to purchase at jaobrien.ie. John, thank you very much for joining us on the programme.
Pat, my pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity.
Now, interesting, the Taoiseach said he absolutely would agree to open any files that the government may have that would help find out the extent of collusion in relation to the Dublin Monaghan bombings. Micheál Martin saying it was a very poignant day, and he praised survivors and relatives for their extraordinary efforts to focus attention on the atrocity many decades on. And Mr. Martin said previous inquiries had made it very clear that they did not get full cooperation from the British state, and that 4 motions have been passed in the Dáil asking for an independent person to have full access to all the documentation